It's been a while. I joined a little while back, but that's basically it.
But Kyle's two viewers know this, that we further discussed the meaning of that one line about the hardening of the hearts.
Oh, from last time, which was
Yes.
not recorded.
We
Yeah.
did not record that part.
Pretty sure I have no viewers, so that's fine.
Well,
Nobody missed
you
anything.
don't know that.
Well, and maybe in the future I'll have
Yeah.
viewers. Yeah.
It'll
That's
blow
fine.
up.
The back catalog will go crazy.
Oh yeah, exactly. I mean, at this point, I'm basically recording these just for my own sake.
This is for when I read Mark again in like 2 years. I'm just like, crap. What did we?
Yeah. Well, what do we talk about there? Yeah. Yeah. That's sort of what it is.
Technically, it'll be on the internet. Well, this is probably not going to be on the internet forever. Let's be real. YouTube's going to die.
YouTube's gonna die. It'll be on the internet for probably at least as long as I'm alive.
Right. So
So-
somebody
Yeah.
might go back and
So
Exactly.
one more night.
What?
The joke isn't killing you tonight.
Oh.
Okay.
That joke could have gone a variety of directions. Yeah.
joke is I'm buying YouTube and selling.
Oh, okay.
I'm making YouTube go bankrupt.
Okay. Mark 7 is what we're doing tonight, boys.
Sorry, Chris.
I'm hoping that we can get through all of it. I feel like a lot of I don't know. I guess I kind of feel a little bit bad about Mark 7 because I've been so focused on Mark 8 that I'm just like, oh, you're just like Mark 7 is just the chapter that I feel like I need to get through to get to Mark 8. But there's still I think some good stuff here. And I'm glad that I kind of went through sort of Mike Winger's stuff because I'm going to glean a few things from him. But then there's also some other things that I was already going to harp on, but he talks about some too. But hopefully we can knock this whole thing out. So Mark chapter 7.
Chapter 7. Now when the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" And he said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of man.' And he said to them, 'You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, "Honor your father and your mother," and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, if a man tells his father or his mother, "Whatever you would have gained from me is Corban, that is, given to God," then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And many such things you do.
Okay. So we talked last time about how Jesus had kind of set up, he had started sending out disciples, kind of set it up, has been going through this process of setting up his own competing structure. And I kind of teased how that structure is starting to kind of collide with the existing authority structure. And anytime that a new structure starts to collide with an existing authority structure, that existing authority structure fights back. Now, this is not the first time that scribes from Jerusalem have come to challenge Jesus. It's actually the second time. They did this earlier in chapter 3. but we see it here again that scribes and Pharisees are coming up from Jerusalem to mostly where he's hanging out, right, which is like Caesarea. Or not, that's not right. Capernaum. But around the Galilee area, around the Sea of Galilee, and so they're coming to challenge him, right? And the thing that they kind of got him on last time was healing on the Sabbath, and his disciples like eating as they went through the grain fields, right? And so both, and now it's hand washing. So in some degrees, their criticisms are like getting worse over time, right? Like really bottom of the barrel stuff about hand washing. And so it's to the point where it's not even something that's like an actual thing that's like against the law. It's against just a tradition that they had. But because they're not living up to the tradition that they had, well, that's license for us to criticize them. So this is a pretty classic story that you'll always hear from like preachers and stuff whenever they're talking about the Pharisees. The Pharisees like tradition, and they don't like or they're not appreciating a proper relationship with God and with Christ.
They're very pro-hygiene.
Very pro-hygiene, right? And so actually on that, I want to hit like a couple of points. One is that actually on the hygiene point, right? So it's one of the things that I always find interesting is that whenever you sometimes whenever you find like a secular person that is actually like friendly to religious thinking, they can be kind of patronizing sometimes, and they'll say things like, oh, well, I think it has some utility, and so they'll kind of accuse like ancient people of like just, they're like ancient science is or ancient religion is really just like science done poorly. And so it's like, oh, well, you guys did all this hand washing for like religious reasons, but in actuality, it was like it was the scientific thing that was going on that like made it work or whatever. No, like that's not really like what's going on. Also because like what's going on here is like they're really kind of probably almost purely talking about like ceremonial type washing stuff. It's not like the disciples never wash their hands or never bathe. Like that's not a thing. Like people in the past bathed. I actually just finished watching
bathed myself.
Oh yeah, no. A Shadiversity video, if you know who that is, on YouTube, where he talked about bathing habits in the Middle Ages, and they're like, yeah, people bathe like pretty regularly. This idea that people didn't bathe, like, it's stupid and wasn't a thing. But here we can kind of see that, like, even with what Jesus is doing, he's kind of going almost directly against that idea, because like, no, like, well, he's not really going directly against it. It's just that the nature of this story helps us to show that sort of a thing isn't in view with what's going on. Like it's not some like secretly poorly done scientific thing that's going on here. There are other things that are occurring. And the thing that's occurring in this passage really is it's kind of interesting for a number of reasons, that it is it helps us to show where we get like our authority from, right? And we've been talking about this a lot, especially with this past month, about like how to hear from God in both youth and in Pastor Kim's sermons. And you don't hear this as much because we're a Protestant church, but if you're like a Catholic church, right, they take tradition really seriously. In fact, they say like sacred tradition. So you can go and listen to debates where they have debates on like sola scriptura versus like sacred tradition and all this stuff. And there are some people that I think take like sola scriptura, which if you don't know what that means, it's a Latin phrase that means like only scripture. I do think that some people take that too far and are like, well, if I don't see it in scripture, like then like it's not a real thing. And it's like, no, there are works that are outside of scripture. There's apocrypha. There is tradition like that people hold to. It's just that you're not supposed to hold to it as strongly, right? There's supposed to be a proper order to how intensely you hold all of these different things, and you're not supposed to outweigh them above other things, which is exactly what Jesus is talking about whenever he calls them hypocrites, right? And he calls them out and he goes, so you're trying to get mad at me about disciples not hand washing, where I can give you a very specific instance or an example of you guys breaking one of the 10 commandments, right? You're breaking one of the main ones. And he also cites where if you break that one, you should die, right? Those are two different things that he does there, right? Because he says, honor your mother or honor your father and mother, and whoever reviles father and mother must surely die. So he's quoting both of those things to show this is the 10th commandment. And also if you break this, you're supposed to die. And you're using this tradition of Corban, right? You're using this tradition of dedicating things to the temple. You're using that as a loophole. And so actually, this is a pretty classic example, in my opinion, of what I always like to say, like, you can't trick God with loopholes, right? I don't care how much you think you know about religious traditions or how religious structures work. You're not going to find a loophole to try and manipulate the rules of God to get the things that you want. All right. That makes you a hypocrite. God sees that, and God's going to correct you, and God's going to call you out on that. Another thing that I want to point out that's interesting, that I just want to have help us think, especially as we're going, we're reading the Gospels and we're constantly kind of going back and forth between Old Testament and New Testament, is this idea of prophecy, right? So Jesus right here says, well, did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites? And then he quotes Isaiah. Part of the issue is that Isaiah is not giving a prophecy here about people in the future, right? This people honors me with their lips, and their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching the doctrines and commandments of and teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. That's an issue during Isaiah's time, and he's speaking it as a prophetic word over the people of his time, and he's criticizing them. But we see one of the things that Jesus himself is doing is he's taking this thing and he's applying it as a pattern to modern people. And so that should be one of the clues that like lets us know that, hey, it's okay that we can take these things that might not necessarily be prophecies in the Old Testament, but whenever we see the pattern repeated, we can go, oh, let's make reference back to that and connect those dots so we can see how that pattern plays out and goes in the future. And that's
a biblical error thing.
yeah. It's like so it's helpful to be like, okay, we're not doing anything that like we shouldn't be doing with the text. When the New Testament writers are doing that, very clearly they get the idea from Jesus, right? Is the idea. Also, completely stole this from Mike Winger, but is interesting. He cites, we've already talked about how Mark is considered one of the earliest gospels. Like basically nobody disagrees with that, but even whenever people agree that it's the earliest, there's still debates about when it gets dated, right? This is pretty standard fare in scholarship. Interestingly, he notes that there's a scholar that is a secular scholar, so not Christian, that says that this is passage in particular, the part about where he says, for the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, because that is in present tense and is talking about them at a certain period of time and how they were acting. He ends up dating the book of Mark to like 45 AD, which would be really early. That's within 10 to 15 years of Christ's death, and is also like probably even before some of like Paul's letters and everything, which most people cite Paul's letters as some of the earliest Christian writings that we have. So if that's the case, that'd be really interesting. I mean, I don't feel like I need to like explain Corbin that much because, right, it says it right there. That is given to God. I don't know about you and mine. That's in red like text. The parenthetical statement that is given to God. I think this is a pretty clear example of that's probably not something Jesus actually said, right? Right? Jesus probably didn't give a parenthetical statement. Like as he's calling out the Pharisees, in case you Pharisees don't know the thing that you're doing, this is what yeah, like that's probably not what he's doing. Like that's a thing that the author Mark or some editor later was like, we don't have a good word for translating this, so we're just going to leave it in there, but we're going to include a parenthetical statement to like make it clear what's going on. That should be allowed. We shouldn't freak out about stuff like that being in the text and being like, someone changed the text. Like, calm down. Yeah, yeah. I don't think Jesus is like fourth wall breaking there to like talk to us.
It's a surprise tool.
Yes, it's a surprise tool for later.
I think it's a funny practice that, I mean, obviously it's not from my kind of problem with it isn't from okay, it's no longer accurate because obviously Jesus didn't say the parenthetical. My thing is like, well, he didn't say the parenthetical, so they need to be in red text. Is like a funny like.
Yes, because it's a weird like
you inserted it, so put it in white text in the parentheses.
Right.
We know what we're referring to, but like the red text, as far as I understand, is supposed to mean this is what Jesus said.
The red text is supposed to mean like the whole reason why editors and stuff put stuff in red text is because it is supposed to be this is like a thing that Jesus said.
Right.
Yes, that is why you put things in red
So
text.
I think it's funny to have a parenthetical be like,
which is also funny because like literally in this same chapter, you go down a little bit and there's another spot in the middle where there's like a parenthetical statement, but because it's not a part of the quote, we can take it out. But the thing is that if you remember, they didn't have quotation marks. So it's like, well, who's choosing where to put the quotes in? Like in all, and so it's like, okay, it's goofy. And here's the other thing too, is like, I'm sure that like, I know I'm like calling it out as goofy that that parenthetical statement is like included as being red text. The people that make actual translations, like the big name translations, they have large numbers of translators that all work together to argue and decide on what they should do and how they should put things together. So I'm sure that somewhere out there, there's like 4 or 5 guys that all have very, very good reasons for why this text is read. I don't know who those people are, and I don't know where to find their writings. But there's probably some like biblical, like textual critics out there that are like, oh no, this should really be read. And they argued it to some guy at who was ever in charge at translating the ESV and all of these other things, and or whatever versions that other people have, and that's why they decided it. And so
Yeah.
there's some level of like, okay, I have to like trust in these like groups of people that are doing these translations. But I do think that if you're going to push me on it, Jesus probably didn't say that is given to God there.
It comes up surprisingly a lot, but in this specific instance between the two that we're citing here, it's likely that it's because maybe as a rule what they're doing is when it's a direct translation. So it's like, okay, he's saying a word in the original
Because he
language,
said that
because he
word.
literally said that, and we're just translating it because
It's like,
all the rest of
okay.
this is a translation anyway. We can keep it in red. While
Sure.
the other one later, that's technically
It's
a
an explanation.
paraphrase.
Yeah, it's a paraphrase.
So it's not, he didn't literally say that, nor did he say that in a different language. So, okay.
So then we don't count
Then
it.
we don't.
Sure.
But it's funny to me just because when you throw it in, okay, because he literally said this, but then you include the original, now you're just like, he repeated himself, and like that didn't happen either.
Right.
But I don't know. It's funny and anything.
There's a parenthetical in like 7 more verses, and it says he, it said I.
Oh yeah, so it takes it out, yeah. But that's kind of, I'm done for that section. Any questions, comments, or anything on that first section? Okay, cool. And I'm hoping that we can wrap all of this up in one. I don't want to do 2 weeks on this.
And he called the people to him again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him." And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, "Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled?" Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, "What comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person."
Okay. So, couple of things here that are kind of neat. So one, I think is, we'll just tackle the surface level kind of like explanation that I really like here, which is that parenthetical statement of, "Thus he declared all foods clean." Clearly this portion, right, is kind of in response to that one that went ahead. That was about not washing. This is kind of an extended diatribe that like Jesus is giving about the hand washing from up above, right? Because he called them out for the hand washing, but why were they doing the hand washing? Because they're worried about contaminating themselves, right? That's why they're doing the hand washing. And so then he goes on to describe, so it wasn't just that he's criticizing their tradition or the fact that they were holding on to a tradition. What he does is he starts analyzing the tradition, which is really what you should do. If you have a tradition that you hold on to, what you should do is not just say, "Oh, that's not in the scripture, get rid of it." No, what you should do is you should analyze the tradition and go, "Okay, why are we doing this? Why are we holding on to it? Is there something more true that we can bring out of it and that we can learn from it?" And and if we're going to stop following that tradition, why would we stop following tradition? Let's give a reason, right? Basically, I'm going to say Jesus is explaining why to not be a liberal here, okay? Right? Because the classic Chesterton's fence thing is like, if you don't know what that is, he's like, if you want to know the difference between a conservative and a liberal, is that if you go into a field and there's a portion of a fence sitting in a field, a liberal will look at the fence and go, there's no reason for that fence. Let's tear it down. The fence doesn't do anything. Let's tear it down. A conservative will look at that fence and go, that fence was built for some reason. There should be a reason that this fence is here. Let's try and figure out why the fence was built in the first place. And then we can decide whether or not we want to tear it down. That's really the difference. And that's what Jesus is doing right here. He's like, let's discuss why you guys were doing all of that. And then we'll try to decide why it's important. The other thing that I think is interesting is because of that parenthetical statement. If you remember, classically, like, so most people, whenever they're like going to be arguing against kosher things, aren't going to use this text. They're probably going to use a different text. They're going to use the story in Acts of the vision of like all the food coming down, and it includes like the unclean animals. Who has that vision or that dream? Peter. Who's the main source for Mark? Peter is. So my guess is that this little like bit right here, this little explanation that's given in the middle, probably not from Mark. It's probably from Peter, right? It's probably a thing where, and if you remember and you go back and you read the instance with Peter and what Peter's talking about, Peter reads that whole thing about all foods becoming clean, and Peter immediately connects it with the idea of evangelizing to the Gentiles. He immediately connects the food with the people, right? And those ideas are together, okay? And so for him, these traditions that are going on, these traditions that the Jews were explicitly using at the time to differentiate themselves from the surrounding pagans at the time, and even from surrounding Jews, right? From Hellenistic Jews, right? We talked about this, about how there were Hellenistic Jews, and then there were like the Pharisees, and the Pharisees were like, we don't want to be like them, because being like them is what led to the exile and all of that stuff. Instead, we're going to be zealous after the law, and we're going to hold to it really tightly because we're super concerned about breaking the law, and we don't want to fall into exile again, and we want to have control, and we want to get rid of these Romans and all that stuff. And so we're going to like be super intense about it. Well, that's causing them to essentially, for the lack of a better term, I guess the right term is jingoistic, or jingoistic, if you know what that term means. It's tribalistic, right? They just care about like their own people. They just care about the Jews, and they just care about the Jews that are doing things the way they're not looking outward to the wider world. They're not, and because of that, they are not looking to be a blessing to the nations, which is what the job of Israel is, right? We talked about that in Genesis. And so for me, it seems pretty clear here that probably the reason why we're having this structure of like these little stories is because probably the person that's like giving all of this, which is Peter, he's connecting all of these ideas together. And he's like, look, they had all of these traditions about how things should work. And that was causing them to criticize us, but they were missing that was that's not really how God intended things to work with people, and all people are going to become clean. And so that's going to lead into the next story, which we haven't gotten to yet, is Jesus going out to the Gentiles, right? This is the first time that Jesus is really going to go out to very specifically Gentiles. He's been to Gentile areas in Mark before, but he's going to go out to the Gentiles and start to bring other people in, right? And so all of these ideas are kind of connected together of food, how you're utilizing tradition to exclude people, and how God wants to get back to the basis of what God's goals and desires are, and by doing that, you'll also bring people in, right? Those things and those ideas go together, right? So, and for me, from coming from a Protestant standpoint, like I kind of think that's true, right? So it's like by eliminating a lot of the rigors and the scaffolding and all of the things that the Catholic Church put on people, that has, and especially depending upon what kind of time frames you're looking at, that has brought more people into the church and has also spread the church out wider than anything else. If you're excluding birth rates, the fastest growing religion in the world is Pentecostalism. And it's blowing up in Africa. It's blowing up in China more than anything else. If you include birth rates, it's Islam. But if you exclude that, if you're just talking about what's going out into all of the world, right, and really changing people, like it's the group that primarily broke away from the strict traditions of the Catholics, but not even just the Catholics, the Anglicans, the Lutherans, like the Episcopalians, like all of these other like they're mainline Protestant, but then there's like additional like miniature reformations that like kind of kept happening, right, until you got to very bare bones and like of kind of non-denominational Christianity, which a lot of times is either Baptist or Pentecostal, right, which is kind of like what we are. And I think that there's a reason for by breaking down a lot of those traditions, you're also able to go out further and reach more people. Okay. So the other thing that I haven't said is that this idea of it's not what goes into a person, but it's what comes out. This is, I think, an instance of Jesus doing what is sometimes referred to as like spiritualizing things, right? He's taking something that he's like, you guys had this this thing that was like in flesh and blood and or in matter and material and worked a certain way, and I'm saying that no, what actually matters is like the spiritual essence. We've already had that happen a couple times in Mark, but I think this is another example of it. And he's showing how, no, you don't need to be freaked out by, so by implication, by saying you don't have to be freaked out about what food you eat, he's also at the same time saying you don't have to be freaked out by what kind of people you hang around with. Like those end up being equivalent statements in the minds of the Gentiles, right? This is actually part of the reason why Paul goes out of his way later in Acts to criticize Peter so much on this very specific point, because Peter had been having all of these like revelations, but Peter wasn't following through it, and he was acting differently around Jews versus around Gentiles, and it became this like big issue. Wow. So that's all that I basically wanted to say from there. Unless we wanted to really go through this list of sins that Jesus gives, I feel like it's.
We all agree that they're sins.
Yes, we can all agree that they're sins.
Theft.
Sometimes it's okay.
Sometimes like you gotta pay the bills. You know?
I mean, Robin is a good guy.
Yeah.
I
Oh,
will
Sam, though.
I will point out the idea of this is kind of like really going off track, but the idea of also because we're going to kind of get into it again with the next thing is that anytime that these like sin like lists are kind of given, it is possible for people to get really fudgy about what stuff means. And that makes sense because these aren't passages that are meant to be super extensive about like, well, what kind of thefts, right? Like,
Because then you're just starting to sound Levitical.
exactly, right? And you because right, you can start getting into people that are like, oh, what if you're a time thief, right? If you slack off while you're at your job, you're getting paid, but you're not doing actual work. That means you're a time thief and you're stealing people's time. It's like, geez, okay, like this isn't Dr. Who, right? And so like there's one sense where I think people can like they'll take a verse like this and be like, see, look, it's included there, but then they'll get so granular about what it means and how it applies, and they can make it you can reword things and you can reframe things so that anything is a crime, right? But then on the other hand, you can take things and reframe things so much that you're like, oh, well, it's not a crime. And I think that
That's what lawyers do for a living.
well, I think it's what a lot of progressive Christians do, right? Especially, so like for one thing is like on the topic of like homosexuality. They'll take a big long list like this and they'll be like, oh, it says sexual immorality. It doesn't include like homosexuality. Therefore, you'll hear people say like, Jesus never spoke against homosexuality. And it's like, yeah, okay. Like, technically, that's true. He just spoke against sexual immorality, and you're kind of supposed to go elsewhere to figure out very specifically what that means. And so so it becomes a thing where we've talked about this on other things where it's like, it's almost a bit of as pointless as a statement to say that like Jesus never spoke on homosexuality as it is to say that Jesus never called himself God. It's like, yes, you will never find Jesus saying the words with quotes around it, I am God. You will in John, but not in Mark, right? You will in like in one of the Gospels. You don't in here. But also, that's not the point. And you have plenty of other things where he says basically equivalent things, and you're supposed to think about the text. You're not supposed to just have it like written out for you like a kindergarten thing that says Jesus is God. Be good. Do this. Like that's not what the Bible is. There's other stuff going on. And so yes, like when people say stuff like that, it's like, oh, okay, that's technically true, but I also don't think it proves the thing that you're trying to say that it proves. So I just want to make have everybody be aware of that whenever we see quick summary things like that in the text, which that's what this is. It's a quick summary thing.
I just want to point out something that's pretty funny in the whole setup. So the original question that the Pharisees and scribes asked him is, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of elders, but eat with defiled hands? And so Jesus took that and then just answered the first question of the two in that sentence.
Yeah.
And answered, okay, why do they not follow tradition? It's like, okay, because tradition is not the number one most important thing. And then two followed it up with, okay, here's also one little thing. This is why they eat with defiled hands. And I just think it's really funny that then the disciples went, yeah, that's cool, Jesus. But why don't we wash our hands? I'm just picturing
Tell him, Jesus.
I'm just figuring the first time that like they didn't wash their hands, then the disciples were like, "We don't wash our hands." All right.
It's like whenever you're a little kid and it's like the first time that like you guys eat without praying before.
Yeah.
Like you're just like, oh, you got away with something.
Yeah.
Oh, wild.
But I think it's just so funny that they just, and it says too that they waited until like the other people were out of earshot.
out of the house.
They were like, okay, Jesus, but like, why don't we wash the hands? And just his reaction, like, you guys don't get it either.
That was one of the other things that I wanted to point out is that it's interesting that it says his disciples asked him about the parable, right? And so, like, they think that this little like saying about like what goes in, what goes out versus thing like that's a parable. And that's kind of really interesting because we don't always think of like something that kind of short or really like that's not even like a story or like anything like that.
No, that was a sentence.
It's a sentence about an idea about how things work, but like that's considered a parable, at least by Mark in this instance. And so that's kind of interesting. Let's keep going.
And from there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth. And she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. But she answered him, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And he said to her, for this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter. And she went home and found the child lying in bed, and the demon gone.
Okay. So because we're kind of already going down that track, the first thing I want to talk about this is that I'm not on TikTok, but I'm aware of it because of other people talking about people that were on TikTok.
Heard of TikTok.
I have heard of the CCP psyop operation that is TikTok. But on there, I think at this point it was like a while ago.
Yeah.
But there was a very progressive Christian pastor.
I was saying quotes.
That I threw up air quotes for the tape. That made the claim that what's going on here is that Jesus was being racist towards this woman whenever he said, it's not right for the children, or it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs, that he's being racist there, and that this indigenous woman of color spoke truth to power, and Jesus, in recognizing that, repented of his racism and then gave grace to her. Yeah, like it blew up because people were like, no. But like the guy who said it is he's very prominent. I should throw up quotation marks in that too, because when I say prominent, I don't know how big his church is or how many people actually follow him. I just think he has a large following on TikTok because he says goofy, stupid stuff like that. And if you're a person that can say, oh, I'm a Christian and I believe this and it's super edgy and different, then you can get a bunch of dumb people on the internet that will follow you. And he's done that. And I've seen like a number of talks and debates with this guy. He's been around for a while. I forget what his last name is. I think his first name is like Brandon something. But yeah, that's not what's going on here.
So is he suggesting that the part where it says and throw it to the dog, are the dogs the foreigners?
Yes. Now,
Okay.
that point about the dogs being the foreigners is correct. So this is kind of the issue. He is right whenever he says what Jesus is doing here. Whenever he says it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. He is talking about the foreigners that are there, and he's including this woman in that like line of thinking. Jesus is doing that. And so, like, is it insulting? Maybe. There we can talk about that a little bit more when we come back to it. But Jesus is not repenting. There's no repentance taking place here, right? And they're really to try and say that she is speaking truth to power, as in like she's correcting him. Not really. That's not really what's going on. She isn't correcting him. What she really, if you read it, what she says is, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Okay. What she does is she acknowledges the proper hierarchy. She acknowledges the way that the world works, right? So if she's like supposed to be this like lowly person or whatever, this like lowly minority, which she kind of is, kind of isn't. I'm going to make an argument in a second that she kind of isn't, because she's from the region of Tyre and Sidon, which you're conveniently ignoring if you just try and say that she's like a minority. Tyre and Sidon are major cities, major players. Like, to try and say that they're minorities is utter garbage. Like, if anything, in this context, Jesus would be the minority. Jesus is going to be outnumbered where he's at. Like, not this lady. That's a ridiculous statement to make. But what she is doing is she is acknowledging both Jesus's status and where he is, and the status of the Jews in God's plan. That's what she does. And it's simply because she acknowledges what God is doing by acknowledging both God's status and by acknowledging God's plan. That's what saves her, or that's what heals her daughter. And I think that's very interesting and something that we should really pay attention to and compare it when we compare it to these other healing things that have occurred. So let me go back and, okay, Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon are, do I have a picture? Look, I thought I had this already and I must have gotten rid of it. Oh no, that's not it. Can I make this bigger? Okay, here we go. Sea of Galilee, right? This is like the region where stuff is going on. Capernaum is up there. That's where most of everything is taking place. Tyre and Sidon are up here, right? When I talked before about Jesus kind of going out into the wilderness and going out into the far reaches, right, into the region of the Apocalypse, that's like out here. Okay, it's out here beyond the Sea of Galilee. It's out here. Although, and remember, I mentioned that some lists of the Apocalypse include places like Damascus. Damascus is way up here. It's not even on this map.
Wasn't it Decapolis?
Did I say it wrong? What did I say?
You're saying Decapolis.
Oh, it's Decapolis. 10 cities.
Yeah.
Whatever.
You were saying something like apocalypse.
Apocalyptic.
With a D.
Depocalypse.
That's not what it is.
He said Damascus.
Whatever. It doesn't matter. The point is that the region, so there is some debate about where exactly is Jesus walking here, and sometimes this gets considered to be one of those Bible contradictions, right? And so if we read the sentence, it says, "From there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre." And nope, I'm thinking of a verse that we haven't gotten to yet. whatever. I'll explain it now, anyways. Verse 31. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee and the region of the Decapolis. Sure, Decapolis, right? Okay. The reason why people sometimes consider that to be a Bible contradiction is because, well, if you're in Tyre, why would you ever go up to Sidon to get to this region down here? They're like, that's a roundabout way to do it. Okay. Yeah.
Is this the one where Jesus doesn't ask for directions?
This is the whole idea of like Jesus doesn't know where he's walking. Jesus doesn't ask
Because he's a man.
because he's a man, right? And so people are like, oh, this shows that like this. So again, I gave you evidence for people saying like why the Bible is like an early document or before. This is sometimes a thing that people will cite as like a thing for like why it's a later document, because see, it's written by someone that's not from the region and doesn't know where all of these cities are at. And so they'll say stupid, goofy stuff like this and they'll get the geography wrong. It's like, well, for one thing, it may have just been that like whenever he went up this way, that he did want to visit Sidon. And one of the things that like one of the arguments that people will make is that like around this region, there are a lot of mountains. And so maybe for getting back down here, he didn't want to go back through this way. Instead, what he wanted to do was he wanted to take the river over and then take a river over and then walk to the Jordan River and then take the Jordan River down. That's an explanation that I have heard people talk about before as being like, okay, and it wouldn't necessarily be that he goes from the city of Tyre to the city of Sidon. It might just have been because this whole like region is considered Sidon, that maybe he just goes from the region of Tyre to the region of Sidon as a means to get back down to the region that's in the Decapolis. Okay. I'm not saying that that's necessarily what it is. I'm just saying there are reasonable explanations for why that explanation could have been in there. We don't get it necessarily in this story. Okay. But now going to like the symbolic aspect of Tyre and Sidon. You should be aware that Tyre and Sidon are like, okay, Tyre and Sidon are emblematic of the things that I've been talking about before about like systems of man, right? And like they're evil empires, okay? And actually pretty explicitly so in the case of Tyre, okay? And if you don't know this, there are a number of passages in the Old Testament that are nobody knows what Satan's origin story is. Okay. People will cite a couple of passages in the Old Testament as like the origin story of Satan. One of those is in Ezekiel. The other one I believe in is in Isaiah. The one in Isaiah is not actually about Satan. It's addressed to the king of Babylon. The one in Ezekiel is not actually about Satan. It is addressed to the king of Tyre. Okay. And so you should be aware of that they're kind of considered like these regions, especially to an Israelite audience, right? These are regions that were really never controlled by Israel. They were always oppositional. There were always people from the north that were coming down and attacking them, partially from Tyre, right? They did this, right? And so the region is emblematic of Gentile influence, of pagan influence, of demonic influence, and also of these man-made systems of governance and of tyranny that are constantly attacking God's people, right? So you should be aware of that. Some people, we don't get a good explanation as to why Jesus is suddenly going to these places. Mike Winger and his thing is like, maybe he's just going there to rest. I think that's a silly idea. You don't make this journey to rest. This is the longest journey. Like, this is a longer journey than what he's going to end up making to go to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a shorter trek than this. Okay. Like, I don't think that's what he's going for. We see no indication that he's going to rest. We don't really know from the text of Mark why exactly he's going to this region right now.
Do you think he could have been like led by God to go there because of meeting this person?
Well, okay, I mean, that's obviously the case, but that's sort of also not an explanation.
Okay.
Personally, I think kind of what's going on here for why this shows up in the story is because of what I said earlier. Whenever I was like, I think that Peter is linking these ideas in his head of the food and the defilement and going out into the Gentiles, that he's just explained kind of why in Mark why that's going to be okay, not explicitly, but then he jumps to, oh, and then that's when we went, like, right? Because if like Peter's the person like saying all these things, he'd be like, okay, this is a thing that happened, this is a thing that happened, this is a thing that happened. And I think that probably what's going on is Peter's like, oh, we had this instance where they all came up, they said these things about us, but Jesus gave this teaching and that showed us why the foods were clean. By the way, like, all the foods are clean. I talked about that earlier. But then, and because Peter in Peter's head, he's like, oh, that means all the people are clean. Oh, that reminds me about the story where Jesus went to Tyre and like we had this encounter with this woman and explained how even what Jesus is doing is going to go to them too, right? And so there's that. There's also the aspect of, oh, I don't want to say it yet because it actually comes in the next part. Sure, I'll say it now. Because we're already at 8 o'clock anyways. Jesus is going to end up being like, he's like secretive again, right? He's gonna heal the deaf a deaf man, and he tells him he charges them to tell him nobody. He says tell nobody again, right? So he's kind of like going back to that, and it's different and it's weird, but it's also that's going to end up being in the Decapolis again or whatever. Which is where the first time, whenever he was there, whenever he freed the guy from Legion, and he actually told that guy to go out and like tell people. And so we're now starting to get the idea of like kind of Jesus being hidden in like the midst of the Gentiles, and like he's starting to filter out even to these like regions that are super, super far away. And eventually those are going to be primed for the disciples. This is where whenever you get to the Great Commission, you're going to end up seeing the phrase, it's like, go out into all of Judea and Samaria and the outer like edges of the world. And so it's like Judea is like very specifically is Jerusalem, right? It's the lower port. Judea is the lower portion. Technically, Capernaum isn't even like included in Judea. That's too far north. Samaria is this upper region where, in like kind of like the can't say that freaking word. Decapolis region would be like included in like Samaria and all this stuff, and then the outer, or like in the rest of the world, would include Tyre and Sidon, right? And so that's that whole like region. And so you have even like Jesus going before them and walking before them, and like tracing that route that the disciples are eventually going to follow. I think I said everything. Oh, the only other thing that I wanted to say is, now that we come back down to the actual exchange between them. In Greek, there are two words for dogs. Yes, dog is typically an insult. Dogs were generally not treated good in Israel at this time. Typically because most dogs were mutts and feral like things that were out in the streets or whatever, and they were annoying, and maybe you could throw them like some food or whatever, but like that was what it. But sometimes dogs were pets, and so because of that, they have a different word for dogs that are pets and for dogs that are just like out on the street and that like you don't care about. Very specifically, the word that Jesus uses here for dogs is the one for pets. It's the indoor ones. It's not the outdoor ones. So of the two words, he uses the less insulting word. Okay.
Therefore, he's not racist.
Therefore, he's not racist. But he is making a distinction between the pet and the child, right? And so by making a distinction between the pet and the child and the table and God, he's establishing this like hierarchy of how the world is set up. And so how the bread, right? So the food like from God is going to spread out. Okay. And I really like that this lady's answer is, and I actually kind of think it's an insult to this lady to say that she is like angrily trying to correct Jesus here for like the sin that Jesus is doing. It's completely not what she's doing. What her statement does is it acknowledges and agrees with what she says, and also anticipates his own character, right? It anticipates that you're not going to just leave us, right? Like you're going to do something even for us. Like I'm going to humbly submit to the order that you've set up, and like you've set up, right? And because let the children be fed first. And so even with Jesus' statement, he is not making the statement that like you're not going to get anything. He's just like, nothing is really going to be done for you right now at this moment. But this goes to the idea that people will talk about a lot, where they say to the Jew first and the Gentile second. And that was an idea that was common, that they were aware of in the Old Testament, about how God was going to bless the world, right? He was going to bless Israel, and then they were going to be the conduit to which they would bless the rest of the world. They would become the blessing of a blessing to the nations. And so Jesus is taking that idea, but applying it very specifically to himself and his power and what he's doing. And he's saying Israel needs to be fed first, they need to experience this power and they need to understand it fully, and then it'll go out into the rest of the world. And that is precisely what happened historically. The earliest Christians were all Jews, right? But then they spread out into the rest of the world, and then they convert a bunch of Gentiles to the point where now the vast majority of Christians are Gentiles and a very small minority are ethnically Jewish.
And they're saying the woman's like, Jesus, please heal my daughter. And he's like, I'm gonna help the Jews first. And she's like, but eventually you're gonna help me too. And he's like, all right, she's healed. Good job. That's basically.
Well, it's
Well,
basic.
It seems like it's kind of a thing where, like, so Jesus says, "Let the children be fed first, or it's not right to take the children's bread," thus implying that what would be the proper way to happen is that you would intentionally feed the children, and then you would intentionally feed the dogs. The dogs would have their own separate portion. But the woman's response here is saying, "But even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." So simultaneously, at the same process as the children are receiving bread, the dogs receive the bread as well.
Yes.
It may not be to the same amount, and it may not be the part that's specifically for them, but
They are going to get a thing that's specifically for them, which is supposed to be the disciples eventually
Right.
going out.
But there's room there for something to happen simultaneously.
Yeah.
I'm more pointing out the fact that she's asking for healing, and he says,
Yes.
I'm gonna teach the Jews. Like
Yeah.
I'm gonna this is how it probably will go. And then she just kind of deciphers his little mini parable, and as a reward he grants her the healing.
Well, and it's and that's part of the
Because
thing.
she really just shows off all the disciples. She's just like, guys, it's so easy.
Yeah.
but here and I want to kind of
'Cause to me-
disagree with what you said because
I'm not saying that's what it is, but it just seems to me it's like Jesus decides to use her request for healing, not necessarily for teaching, at least on the surface. That's what she's asking for, and Jesus is like, well, let's talk about being fed, like life.
so here's the thing. I would actually argue Jesus kind of doesn't heal the daughter here. Right? So like what it says is, for this statement, you may go your way, the demon has left your daughter. And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. This is the idea that I was trying to get across, is that he kind of like yes, the power of like the demon leaving her does ultimately come from Jesus. But it's sort of not, right? Jesus doesn't really actively do anything here. Jesus just says, your statement, the thing that you said, the thing that you acknowledge about the truth of how the world works, that's going to cause the demon to leave. You can go, right? He kind of didn't do anything, right?
That's an interesting realization.
And so it sort of is this idea of he really didn't feed. He really didn't feed her, right? And this feed idea, this right? She is asking for healing. That's what she's asking for. She's asking for healing, but she's also asking for a demon to be gone. Like but she gets a lesson about the world. She gets a teaching. So these threefold things that we've been talking about, like the teaching, like the lesson or teaching, casting out demons, healing, right? It's all getting like twisted into one thing here. And it's ultimately the acknowledgement of the teaching of what's going on is the thing that heals, casts out the demon, fixes the problem. It's just the acknowledgement of who Jesus is. He doesn't go. He doesn't even say like let your daughter be healed. He just says, you may go now. Like, you're done here.
Well, it may even be that it's more of a, just from a standpoint of a statement of faith, and perhaps that the statement really that made the demon leave wasn't the thing about the dogs, but the first thing she says, which is "Yes, Lord." Therefore, instantly choosing which side she's actually on,
Yes.
and just from that very act, from that alignment, the demon is gone.
And that's the point that I kind of want to make is that it's almost not even a statement of faith. It's a statement of allegiance, right? And this has been kind of one of my things that I've tried to harp on a lot. That really the thing that saves you, like, because everybody knows that, like, it's not belief in Jesus that saves you, right? And so I've talked a lot about, and if you like listen to Michael Heiser, he has this phrase that he calls believing loyalty. He's like, really what you need is believing loyalty. I've said for years that I'm like, okay, to know if someone is really a Christian, God needs to be their God. That's the thing that I used to like say a lot. I'm like, that's really the thing. God needs to be their God. It can't just be that you believe that God exists. He needs to be your God. And really the single word that encapsulates that is allegiance, is your allegiance to Christ, is your allegiance to God. And that's the thing that actually in the whole Bible, in the Old Testament and the New, that's what it is. So it's not this thing where in the Old Testament you got saved by works and by following the law, and now in the New Testament it's grace. That's not true at all. In the Old Testament and in the New Testament, you are saved by allegiance. That's what it is. It's just that allegiance got acted out through the law in the Old Testament, and that law is no longer a requirement for displaying your allegiance in the New Testament, but we learn that it was functional in the Old and in the New via his grace, right? His grace we learn this in the New Testament, that his grace gets applied retroactively to the people in the Old Testament, right? This is read Paul, right? This is his whole point, okay? And so it's not that it's two systems, it's that it's one system through the whole way through, but we didn't really understand how the system worked until Jesus came and did what he did. That's what it is. And so really what's going on here is, yes, I agree, is that the yes, Lord is an allegiance statement, and the follow-up is is the continuation of that allegiance statement, and displays that she's allegiance because she recognizes his status, her status, and the relationship of the world and how everything works. And so if you have that right, like, demons can't touch you. Like, you're gonna be fine. And that should be evident and that should be linked to the idea of what I talked about before of this is like claimed territory, Tyre, Sidon, domain of Satan, right? You should kind of have those ideas in the background that even here, Jesus is able to come in and like change things and change the world. All right. We're going to rush through this last part.
It's really text.
Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak.
Okay, so a couple things that I want to hit really fast. So we see like we already talked about the traveling thing. We'll redo that. We can see that there's a change in the way that the people of the region are reacting towards Jesus. When we were last in this area, the people of the region literally were trying to kick Jesus out of the region. But you could probably infer that because of the testimony of that one guy, because that one guy was supposed to be going around giving his testimony, that things have changed and things are changing in the region. This is a very detailed account of Jesus healing this guy. It's slightly different. We've had the before about him saying a specific word and it gets translated, so that's kind of the same, but it is very different about how he's like he put his fingers into his ears and after spitting touched his tongue, and then looked up to heaven, said it, and all of this stuff went on. I don't have a great thing about why this one is particularly more detailed than the other ones. But I'm gonna blatantly steal this from Mike Winger, which is a thing that I liked what he said, which makes a lot of sense to me, which is that it probably has more to do with the perspective of the deaf man, right? Which is that by Jesus doing these different actions, it let the deaf man like know like what was going on, right? Like he's like maybe he couldn't like read lips, maybe didn't know what he was. He probably spoke a different language, right? Like, and so by doing all of these different things, he might be signaling to like the deaf man, hey, something is going on. And also he was relating it to the idea of, again, the same thing that happened at the beginning of the chapter, which is everybody being worried about washing of hands and how things get defiled. In the same way that like you don't touch certain people because like their defilement can transfer to you. You don't touch the ears of a deaf person. You don't touch the tongue of like a mute person because that defilement might get transferred to you. But instead, what happens is whenever Jesus touches those parts, they become healed. They become whole. And so it's a reversal and it's a demonstration of the thing that he talked about earlier of the defilement doesn't come from without and from within. What matters is like who and like it matters what's within. And so that eventually is going to become the question of like who is within you, right? And that is what you can display outward, right? That was all I really wanted to say about that portion. I could do more, but I'd rather wrap up and talk more about chapter 8 and stuff next week. Questions, comments, anything? We've gone for a long time, so I'll just end it.